Hi, Holly. How are you?
I'm good. How's it going?
I'm doing well. So today we're going to be talking about self-worth. So this is kind of at the core of so much of personal development. It's really once you get these things lined up, a lot of problems take care of themselves. And so it's really this idea of I'm not good enough, I'm not worthy, I'm not deserving. So we're going to go into exploring why that is, like where these things come from, how to build self worth and unravel some of these past scenarios. So I guess, through our work, a lot of our conversations focus on, reframing past experiences so that we don't make it mean negative things about ourselves. Right. So as we've gone through that journey of basically reworking the past, how do you feel like your self worth has improved?
All right. So I think that's it's gotten a ton better, and I know that's like super general and not really specific, but it's not something I think about in the same way that I did before. So the feelings associated with not good enough come up less frequently. For sure, there's just a level of confidence that's associated with some of that not good enough being diminished or set aside. Yeah. So I think that's through this work, like that's been a huge change.
Well, so the powerful message here is that it's not fixed, right? We can work on these things.
Yeah.
So whichever wherever it is currently, that's a product of the past, right? It's like this is how I was raised, this is how I was taught to think about myself, or how I've internalized or interpreted experiences in my life, and so we quite literally build confidence by addressing the past, right? It's simply just like, well, yeah, I don't have to hold on to these negative beliefs, or I don't have to see myself in the same light now that I understand these situations better. And so that's, we're going to start off first with going into the mechanics, like where do these things come from? And then, we're gonna try and keep building off of that and into what we do about it currently. And so, this journey, it's there are some people, it's depending on really your upbringing, the household you're brought up in, and like how the parenting styles have a huge impact on this. And if you have this kind of loving, unconditional household, uh, where it's like you're accepted and loved and nourished, we're gonna have a lot less of the self-worth stuff to work on. And but if I was made to feel like I have to achieve in order to get love, or that it has to be perfect, or I usually get stuck in this place of nothing's ever good enough. Okay. And or if there's a lot of criticism, let's say I had a parent that was hypercritical, basically we're going to adopt a similar behavior or relationship with ourselves. So we're going to be hypercritical of every mistake we make, and that's really a lot of where perfectionism comes from, is thinking that everything has to be perfect and then everything's going to be okay. Otherwise there's consequences or punishment, or negative feedback, things of that nature. So these things come out in many different ways. And so ultimately it is very environmentally based, I would say. I think this is where, you know, what we're surrounded with and whether we have the emotional support to work through challenges, that's where we start to create this internal dialogue of really trying to formulate who we are and what value we bring in the world, and how we can show up and what's safe for us to do. And also ultimately it's like what's where we get positive feedback or love is an important idea when we're dealing with self-worth. So if love's withdrawn, usually I'm going to make that mean something negative about myself. So, we just have to zoom out in these areas, and we have to take a deeper look and be like, well, was that accurate given these circumstances? And so, you know, as I bring these things up, I guess which aspect really stands out for you? Like, what do you feel like you've struggled the most with? Is it more
Uh,
perfectionism, or being like in that hypercritical, or just not feeling like you can take the steps because you're not good
I think it's both. I don't
enough?
know that it's just one for me, but I was thinking as you were talking through that where it comes from in terms of early childhood experiences. I'm a child from a divorced family early in life, and I think a lot of the not good enough came from that and struggling with the, if I could have been different, if I could have been better, maybe that wouldn't have happened, or maybe
Mhm.
some of the choices that my parents made would have been different if I had been different. So I think there's some of that, and then, you know, you can couple that then with the ideas of perfectionism, right? If I write the perfect paper, if I get the good
Yeah,
grades, if I do XYZ things just the way they would have wanted me to do them, then everything will be okay. And I will
yeah,
minimize chances of discomfort.
yeah. Well, and another important area is this is where like siblings generally come in is this idea of comparison. So how we're treated in relationship to siblings or our peers, that can also feed into these stories of like, oh, this person got good feedback for this, but I got different feedback, or maybe I should try and be like them in order to get that feedback. So these things show up in many different ways. Yeah, I'm also from a divorced household. My parents divorced when I was about probably 2, so I don't ever remember them together, and so I always thought that was actually, like, a good thing to rather just start off that way, because then I wouldn't know any different. With that, I guess on my dad's side, I feel like the hypercritical thing is what stuck with me the most. I was, feeling like I couldn't make a mistake, and that's a lot of the perfectionism came from that. And so on those ends, what's the gift in it is, perfectionism is you learn to work really hard at things. Attention to detail like goes off the charts, right? Of like,
Right.
I have to make everything perfect. So that can like be really good at developing skills, but then it can also like hold us back from taking risks or chances. So that's kind of one aspect there. And I guess I didn't really ever struggle with in terms of like if I would have done this differently, that would have fixed these problems. But it was just more of like, I guess mine showed up as I need to achieve to get love or to get praise. And so I need to be perfect in those types of things. So yeah, it's like each one of us like has a different experience with it. And what's really interesting is with a lot of these situations, you'll see people that on the outside, it looks like, they have loving and supportive parents and things are pretty good, but still like a product of that is some people do think that, oh, I have to achieve as much as my parents or I have to surpass them or whatever. So these things are going to show up regardless in some way or another. It just depends on the intensity of it. And usually the intense versions comes from pain. So it's like, so the lighter versions is going to be, oh, I feel like I disappointed my parents or something like that. Maybe I didn't achieve as much as, or the expectations were too high. That's going to be a softer version, but you might get people that really dig themselves into a hole, get super hypercritical of themselves and think they're completely worthless. If and that's generally gonna come from painful upbringings where, somebody was super harsh. There could be abuse, things of those nature, where it's like you're almost like punishing yourself. So everything's kind of on the spectrum. And and so, what I find is like when you have the deeper version, there's so many more kinks to work out. So that's generally like if you take that journey to try and work through it, that's going to be like a super like interesting, deep person. Because that pain, it is this powerful teacher, and so because our nervous system, it is wired to keep us safe. So there's so many survival instincts you have to overcome in those types of environments that if somebody does take that journey, generally they come out the other side like highly skilled, very compassionate. It is like there's some cool byproducts that come from that process, even though it is very painful and it can take a long time. But it's like, and a lot of times that's made from of like, let's say somebody's going to have their own family. They'll be like, oh, I don't want my kids to experience the same thing I did. Or, you'll see that commonly if somebody's been through a lot of pain, they're going to want to choose the different path. And so that's where they dig in and they take that journey to try and sort through all the pain and show up differently in life than maybe their parents did. So these things they're the powerful catalysts. And it's one of those interesting paradoxes where it's like, it's like we all push against discomfort and suffering. But usually that's what develops us. That's what helps us grow. That's what pushes us to be a better person and to make a big impact. It's generally from our biggest wounds that we start to formulate our skill set and then also like our purpose in the world. So there's so many like interesting things that spring out of this.
Sure. In your experience, either through coaching or personally, when you think about the development of self-worth, let me back up. It's not the development of self-worth, it's the things that we do because we don't have it, right? That sort of prevent us from moving forward. So if you think about it from the standpoint of all of the things that people do to stop themselves, right?
Mhm.
From taking the next step or from getting better, or maybe it's, the belief related to self-worth is so deep, it's like, I'll never be good enough for XYZ, or who do you think you are
Mhm.
to go do this thing that you wanna go do?
Well, so with those, so that's the thing. So most people do succumb to that, all that, where it's like, oh, like this is just the way it is, right? And so it always like starts with the questioning. Generally, we need some outside external influences or models that can show us a different path. And I think for me, I think it was a rebellious spirit where when I saw people that you know, got further along or climbed out of it, like it was just like, oh, I can do that too. And so I'm gonna push against like any beliefs that say I can't do it. So that's that you develop that chip on your shoulder. And so that's generally based on pain and anger and things like that, is like, oh, I can do it too, like they're not better than me. That's like what propels you forward to try and get out of it, but at the bottom of it, there's still that. So I might be fighting against that idea that I deserve better, but there's a part of me deep down that doesn't believe it, right? And
Right.
so that's where we
Right.
have self sabotage that shows up. Is is that like I may be taking the actions to support what I say or what I believe, but then there's also part of me that might short circuit and be a little bit destructive anytime I get close to it. Right?
Right.
And so that's
Right.
gonna be that deeper part that still feels unworthy, that still feels not good enough, right? And so, yeah, I mean, that's the thing. It starts with you kinda like anger is a catalyst. It drives action, and so that's generally how it first shows up when you try to break out of these cycles. And so that's the thing. So sometimes that anger, once we take the actions, the thing is we don't have the foundation set up. We don't have the foundation set up for success or self-compassion in order to make mistakes, things like that. And so we get like burnout, exhaustion, we get extreme negative mindset where, yeah, we do just like pick ourselves apart to the point where maybe we can't move forward. And so that's shifting this relationship with ourselves is ultimately what's going to give us that path forward in a cleaner way. And so that's saying, so hesitancy, manipulation tactics, things like that, that's going to be because I feel like I have to do things outside myself in order to make things happen because the foundation is not set internally. Okay. So this work is always like an internal game. If I don't feel good enough, I am always looking outside myself for validation. I'm wanting people to validate me, to approve of what I do, to praise me, like all those things. And so much about being successful and operating in a clean way is being more self-sustaining, where I show up and do these things because this is who I am. It's not because I need the feedback or the praise, right? So
Right.
that's kind of the crossover where through the pain and through sorting everything out and trying to rework what I believe about myself, I do become this self-sustaining circuit where it's like I can feel good about myself regardless of what's going on externally. And that's because you're pulling from this deep well of like, oh, like I've overcome so much. I've gotten stronger each time. I've transformed my pain into compassion and some and action to produce better outcomes for people and myself. And so there's all of these good things that come from that journey. But it is kind of messy in the beginning. There's no other way to do it. Is like when you're functioning from pain and you're hard on yourself, and you feel like you can't make a mistake. We have to create space to allow for all that, right? And
Right.
and it's like interesting in a lot of males, you'll see this also negative connotation with emotions. And this is a very emotional process. And so you actually do need to be able to feel things to in order to sort it out. So if I have like suppressed emotions, it's going to be very difficult for me to reconcile things because I'm not giving myself permission to feel what I feel because I think it's a bad thing. And so I leave it in that place. But then also I'm trying to move forward. Okay. And so those two things are in conflict because within that area that I've suppressed, I have all these negative beliefs about myself, these destructive beliefs about, and there could be a lot of shame too. With shame is generally this idea that we need to punish ourselves. So we can't allow success in our life if we feel like we're a bad person, right?
Right.
So there, because whatever it is, we're gonna destroy it. That's what that is. And so we need kind of this perfect recipe to have a this ability to feel and process emotions. We need to be able to open them up in a safe place. We need to be able to re-examine the past and come to a new conclusion. The way we do that is we continually zoom out. We try to depersonalize things that have happened to us, and we try to see it as like, oh, if this person hurt me, you know, what were they functioning from? Like, what
Right.
was their upbringing? Like, how were they raised? Like, what did they believe about life? And so many of these things are generational, where it's just keeps getting passed on until somebody becomes a little bit more conscious and starts to question these behaviors. Okay.
Right.
And so that's the thing is it's like it's it takes a strong person to plant your feet and be like, okay, well, like I'm gonna choose differently. Deep down, I feel like I'm worthy. And so I'm gonna take this messy journey to try and like pick up the pieces and make sense of it in a way that I can build something from. And so it's a lot of back and forth. Like every step I take, I'm gonna be confronted with also intense negative beliefs about myself.
Right.
That stuff's going to surface and I'm going to have a lot of emotions. And so, you literally have to go through kind of withdrawals, like emotional withdrawals, uh, each time you face these situations. Because it's like this is stored information and it has to be brought to the surface so that I can examine it and choose a better way. Right. And so I always facilitate this idea of neutralizing negative emotions, right? Because we're trying to come to peace with our past. So I need to take it from this negative place and I need to figure out some way of looking at it so that I can be more neutral about it. And in that place, I'm going to see the gifts that came out of the pain. Okay. So I'm completing the situation. I call it resolving the
Yeah.
situation, which means that if I leave it in the negative place, it's incomplete, and that's going to stay with me forevermore until I can address that. And
Sure.
so I need to go back and I need to gain my self worth back from the pain. Whatever I made that situation mean about myself, if it means negative things about myself, I need to rework it so that it's at least neutral, or at least see how like and it's a depersonalization process, being like, well, yeah, I was in this situation. This is how my parents were raised. This is what they were taught. And so they did the same things. It wasn't actually about me. Like they would have done that anyway. Right.
Right.
And so we start to extract, we start to remove ourselves from the dynamic so that it starts to clean up the story around it, where it's not actually about me. And so I start to strip out the negative beliefs about myself.
Sure.
And so that shows up and, it's like, oh, I can be less detached from these highly charged or more detached from these highly charged emotional situations. We had that conversation today. It's like, where
Yeah.
were you at a year ago in relationship to this idea? And it is going to be show up in this form of detachment, meaning I'm not taking the situation personal anymore. I was involved in it, but other people's actions are on them. It's not necessarily about me.
Right. As you were talking through that, I was thinking about another example. Particularly for some folks, it might be common to have their self-worth impacted by religion. or being raised in a really religious household.
Mhm.
And when you think, you talked about things being generational, I remember, my stepdad talking about in a super conservative Christian home, right? Like these ideas around having to be a certain way or a certain kind of good, right? And that impact on self-worth.
Yeah, well, ultimately, what we're talking about is shame-based programming, all right? It's like whenever if I'm feeling something or if I'm acting a certain way that's like wrong in relationship to this person's interpretation of how somebody should be, right? And so I said, these are super common things where it's like everything is based on the interpretation of the individual delivering the information, right? So if and then we see that there's so many different manifestations of Christianity or any religion, right? Like there's all these different offshoots and they're different interpretations, right? And so,
Right.
there's some that are yeah, more harsh. There's some that are softer. It's like, and that's saying so we can't say it's like at at the bottom of it, there's a lot of good pieces that are there, but it just depends on who's delivering it. And so that's where you see a lot of wounds around um religion is it's like, oh, this happened to me and it came from this lens, and so it must mean this is all bad. Okay.
Right.
So we start to overgeneralize like certain beliefs about religions or systems. It's like, oh, it's all bad. Well, no, it's like this person, maybe they're interpreting it from a place of pain, they're delivering that information from that place, and so that's not going to be a clean interpretation. So that's how all these things they're highly variable, and so I always just encourage people to find what's right for you, right? It's like there might be a healthier balance with spirituality that works better for you in your life. That's you may have needed the intense experience around it to clarify that, being like, oh, this doesn't feel right to me. Like I don't want to operate that way. So I'm going to find a version that suits me. It's just like always finding that individual preference because we are all unique. We all do see things differently. And that's a big part of self-worth is sometimes I interpret things about myself in a really negative, bad way. And so now that's going to really affect how I show up in the world. That's going to affect how I interact with other people. That's going to affect how I see information or receive it. Right. So I could be reading, the Bible. Um, if I'm reading it through a place of pain relative to the situation, then that's gonna come off in an unclean way. Like I can't I'm not qualified to teach, like, if I'm still actively struggling with something, right? And so you always want teachers that have, like, done the work themselves. And so that's like I don't I do my best to stay away from topics that I'm still actively working on, right? Like, I don't wanna if I have pain around something, my advice or my input on it isn't gonna be as clean as it could be, right? And so that's where that self-awareness comes in of like, who's the messenger? Because all the information is inherently neutral and it's based on the delivery of the messenger, whether it's got the negative connotation or not. So if I have somebody that's really hypercritical in that place of pain, that's the lens they're seeing through the world. And if I don't want to adopt that same worldview, then yeah, I need to clean that up.
Okay. So as we were talking, this is not necessarily related to the podcast, but I just had to say this because I had the aha moment about what we talked about earlier.
Hmm.
I think the reason that I have so much, and maybe this will stay in. We'll see if this example is good enough. I had this realization that the thing we were talking about, right, where I have a real problem with somebody saying something negative about me or talking about me in a way that I can't control it, right?
Hmm.
Is because of the way that I don't know why I didn't think of it until just now, but that my mom would talk about how it wasn't safe to have other people talk about the situation that we were in, right? So
Hmm.
she would constantly be telling us, like, "Well, don't say that to so and so. It's not safe to tell them. They'll turn us in. This'll happen,
Hmm.
that'll happen, bad things will happen."
Hmm. Yeah, so
So
it's the distress messaging, right? So,
right.
especially when we're young, you know, there's so much we're yet to learn, right? Like we don't really understand how things operate. And so if it's coming from a parent that's like really stressed out, operating from that place of pain or negativity, basically we just absorb it, right? It's just like, oh, like this is a bad thing. And so we start to suppress that, we shut it down and we wall it off, right? And so, that's, and anything that doesn't feel good, our mind makes comments about it, right? That's what our
Right.
thoughts are, is tell the story about what we're feeling. And if something, we're told something's bad and we just leave it in that place, basically I'm going to be in this avoidance pattern of that until I question it, right? And so that's the importance of these ideas, is like, if anything was painful for us, we do need to dig deeper and we do need to question it, because there's probably parts of ourselves that are locked up in that. There's parts of our self-worth, our ability to show up in the world. And that's the thing, if I was like told, I need to hide, or I can't be seen, or I can't use my
Right.
voice, like all these things are going to affect us and how we show up in the world. That's going to lead to playing small ultimately, right? And so self-worth is this ability to be like, well, yeah, I did. If I put the work in, if I develop this, like, of course these good things can happen to me. But if
Right.
I have beliefs that are in contradiction to that, meaning like it's not safe to do so, okay, now I have this internal conflict, and that's where we see this, the lack of congruence, where people are saying, "Hey, I'm doing this," but then there's this part of them that shuts down, and so they can't fully execute it, right? And
Right.
so that's why it's so important to reconcile these things, because if something like ex- if it was dangerous, if our safety is like wrapped up in this belief, that's going to get priority over everything, right? And so that's
Right.
why we have a lot of sabotage. That's why it's I can't even let myself go there. I can't even like believe that this is possible for me, because this painful thing, says that it's not okay to think that. Okay.
Right.
So that's where we go in and we try and figure out like, hey, how can we make peace with this? Because they're complex emotions. So complex emotions means that this one event like created like 15 different beliefs or ideas about a situation. And so I have to go back and I have to like address each one of those to try and let these things go, because that's how I create safety, is I have to address each one of those concerns. Our mind is just trying to keep us safe. That's its job. And
Right.
so if I'm trying to override it, I'm gonna have a lot of internal backlash going on, because it's just like, "Hey, I'm trying to keep you safe, like, you can't do this." And that's where anxiety comes up, that's where a lot of the alarms are, is we're trying to take steps that we haven't quite reconciled yet, that they're still left in the place where it's unsafe. And then if we sabotage something, or if we don't take the steps, that furthers the idea of our low self-worth, right? It
Right.
becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy of like, oh, see, like I wasn't able to do what I said I was going to do, and I failed. And, it starts to build the victim story over time, that no matter what I do, it never works out. Right.
Right.
And that's because we're not addressing, the root issue, which is going to be stuff from your past. It's going to be like, hey, this isn't safe. Like, if we leave it in that place of intensity, you're going to be at war with yourself every step of the way. Right. And
Right.
so, it's like we do want to address that first, and that it smooths out the path so much. Everything's so much easier from this place of like, okay, I calmed my system. I reprogrammed it to believe that this situation's okay and that it's actually going to benefit me rather than cause more pain.
Right. Well, I think it's so interesting too, just in terms of the conversations you and I have, or even just connecting those dots to the moments of like, oh, well, I attached a lot of this to this idea of being unsafe, right? And it's interesting how it could have been, and sometimes was in my case, situations that actually were unsafe.
Mhm,
But it also could, but then that gets so attached to, like, things that are perfectly safe, like, there's nothing that can happen today that looks
mhm.
like that thing, but just how many conversations we have to have and, like, talk through, to your point of, like, all the different things that touches, to actually get to be like, "Oh, yeah, there's really nothing that anybody can do to hurt me in terms of the situation or the goals that I have for myself," or whatever it might be.
Yeah, I call it getting up to speed with who you are now. And so that just means like, Yeah, the reality says many of these things I'm trying to protect myself from, they're really not in play anymore. That stuff ended a long time ago. But because our system is wired for survival, we do get stuck and we get caught up there until we address it, right? That's the thing is it's like we're always trying to reconcile, okay, if I'm going to take this step forward, what from my past says that's not okay, right? And
Right.
so that's why we can't just like I, we would all love to just like move forward very rapidly and never question ourselves. But it just takes it takes a while to get there. You see this with like business owners, right? Like entrepreneurs. It's like everybody says like, oh, it takes 10 years pretty much to get your business going. Uh, and so
Yeah.
so that's because it's like you're basically fighting all these battles with yourself, right? I want to play on this bigger level, but I don't believe I'm good enough for that, or whatever it is. There's so many like kinks to work out before you actually start to run,
Right.
right? And so this is like equated to like a high performance like athlete, right? It's like there's a lot of like big things that you work on in the beginning, but like the further along you get, it's just there are micro adjustments. It's like okay, we need to adjust this and this. And so that like aligns the pieces a little bit better. So that they're able to own more, commit more fully, right? They might be at
Right.
like 90% rather than like 70, right?
Sure.
And so you're just trying to overcome all the things holding you back are literally just beliefs you have about your past to keep you safe. Okay.
Right.
So that's what a limitation is. It's nothing more complicated than that. You know, there may be like, oh, I need more knowledge, I need more practice, but most of the things that shut us down, once we've been at something for a while, it's going to be trying to reconcile the past with the direction we're heading. And so it becomes a lot of these fine, we call it fine tuning. That's
Right.
any high performer, that's what you're doing is it's you're making like micro adjustments. You're not like changing, all the beginner work is that's going to be bigger adjustments, right? So it's just like we all have this stuff to some degree. It just depends on how much survival is attached to it, right? So yeah, let's say I'm pretty much good, but like one situation really terrifies me. Okay, that's where I'm going to
Sure.
shut down. That's where you'll see, like a race where somebody just does terrible, right? It's because if they're consistently doing well and then something happens, it's going to be something got woken up from their past. That's what that's going to be, because it's something happened that they consider highly unsafe, and so their body clamped down and shut down on them, and then they had extreme negative thoughts. Okay. Uh,
Sure.
so
Sure.
so you'll see this often, before people are about to break through is they have to overcome this last piece that says they're not good enough, basically, right?
Right.
The one that's like, oh, I need to play small because this is safer, right? Or this is
Right.
what I know, and then that's where the fear of success would come in, is like, oh, if I break through and have success, like what does that mean? If we have negative associations to that, that's also going to be a self worth thing because it's going to be like, oh well, yeah, let's say, I had like a rich uncle or something and,
Sure.
he got successful and, everybody, just started using him and trying to take all of his money or something like that. Right. I might be like, oh, well, yeah, I don't want money then because then all my relationships are going to change. Right.
Sure.
It's like these things
Yeah.
can show up many different ways, but it's like, oh, if I've seen this model of it and it turned out to be a bad thing, then it's like, well, I guess I don't want that experience. So I'm going to shut that down. Right.
Right.
And so it's like, okay, that is a version, that is a reality that can happen. But how do I build my version in a cleaner way? Like, how do I actually, and it's going to be refining your circle. It's going to be building real relationships. Right. It's,
Right.
it's not going to be just, yeah, you probably will like do things in a more conscious way because you've seen that example, but it's not gonna be like but that's the thing, so when we see painful situations, generally, we go to all or none thinking and make, you know, these huge generalizations about, "Oh, this is bad," like, no matter what,
Right.
right? And so part of success is getting more intentional, more clear about how you want things to go and setting things up that way, right? Because, yeah, there's every different version of reality, it's like, yeah, there's good versions, there's bad versions, but usually the good version is like that person put a lot of conscious thought and effort into it, and they did things in a specific way based on their own preferences, on like how they want to live.
Right. Right. Can you say more, or I think the self-sabotage thing is interesting. And so I'm just wondering if we can talk more about that. I'm trying to come up with some examples. I mean, I can think of some directly related to triathlon things, right? Where you put all this effort into prepping for a race, and then maybe you get to race day and you decide today is the day that you're going to try a brand new nutrition strategy,
Mhm.
or maybe you've trained for a whole season taking in a certain amount of fuel, and then you decide, oh, I'm going to do half that on race day, whatever, right?
Mhm.
Something like that, where that could seem sort of obvious, or maybe there's like more subtle versions. I don't know. I think that's interesting, and maybe we should explore that just a little more.
Well, so with self sabotage, basically what's happening here is we're going to prove ourselves right about what we believe about ourselves. Okay. So subconsciously, if I don't feel good enough, or if I have this like fear, I'm not going to be consciously aware of that. It's going to show up in kind of weird, quirky ways. We call those blind spots, right? Somebody may think they're doing things perfectly the way they should, but to an outsider, you're just like, yeah, that doesn't make any sense, right? These are like
Right.
the irrational things. And so we bring things, success is going to be about bringing things to that logical place of like, oh yeah, basically I've covered my blind spots, so I can move forward in a clean way that isn't that there's no part of this that doesn't make sense. All the pieces are aligned. Okay. And
Okay.
so that's a clear indication somebody is sabotaging is whatever their action is, it's not going to make very much sense to somebody that's rational, right? So, that's what it is. I'm motivated to believe it, to make what I believe about myself true. Okay.
Right.
So I can't believe, that this isn't possible for me and make that happen, because that's where the sabotage is going to surface. It's going to basically make it not happen. And then I'm going to continue to confirm, see, this is why, I shouldn't even try. This is why
Right.
X, Y, and Z. That's the thing. So these things are super important, and it is going to be stemming back to self worth. It's like, well, I don't believe I'm that person, and so the journey is always about becoming somebody that can do these things. Okay, and so that's an internal job, is to rewire yourself to be in support of what you're trying to accomplish.
Right.
Okay. So I need to squash the self worth stuff. I need to let go of any of these negative beliefs that are going to be in direct conflict with what I'm trying to accomplish. Because, like I said, it's to varying degrees. The closer I get to the goal, like it might be, there might just be kind of little weird things that I'm doing, but
Sure.
it might not
Sure.
be as big, but there's going
Right.
to be like little things, like little escape routes, little like sabotage patterns that are going to be showing up. So if I'm going to reach my potential, which is going to be like, I'm 100% on board, and I'm doing exactly what I say I'm going to be doing. And I believe this is possible for me. There's going to be a power to that, right? So, I'm sure we've all seen examples of that person that's like completely aligned on every level, firing on all cylinders. It's extremely
Right.
rare. So when we see it, it is impactful. Okay. And that just means they've addressed pretty much all these pieces that says they can't do something. So that's what the journey is it's about, they get smaller as you go, the further along you get, but they're still there. And so, yeah, I might be operating at like 95% of my capacity. But once I get over to that 100, like, there's just going to be such a strength and confidence and competence to that, those are like, the Michael Jordans and, like Simone Biles or something, right? Like, so those
Sure.
people that it's like, yeah, this is like incredible to watch, right? Like, it's like shocking, but that's like a person that's like 1,000% on board with it. Okay. So
Right.
we all have these like lesser versions, and that's where this stuff comes from. It's like the things that make you doubt yourself, question yourself, make you feel not good enough. That's what creates hesitancy. That's what creates blocks in our energy flow. That's what creates blocks in our ability to move forward. And so these are at the higher levels, these are smaller adjustments, but it's such a beautiful thing when you get that the moment where it all starts to click. Um,
Right.
and that's where things are special. So everything is working up towards that. And it's also difficult to maintain, right? Once you hit that, it's like, well, my standards for my life have to be at such a high level that I'm not bringing in things that can sabotage me. So I literally cultivate an environment for my success as well. Like all the people I have around, like
Right.
all the relationships, I've developed a way of operating that keeps everything clean and functioning at a high level.
Right. So can can overthinking, reluctance to make decisions, or things like that, I mean, I think those play into self-sabotage too, right? Like, they're just a different version of it, and I think in in my own life, I struggle with this feeling of the way that I get good enough is by knowing more, right? Like, if I
Mhm,
know more, if I read more, if I consume more, and I can essentially regurgitate that crap and back into the world, that sometimes has, like, a sense of value, but then it's also becomes like a scarcity thing, right? Because it's not possible to
mhm,
actually know enough. These are the like, in my own head. And then in the needing to know, I can delay making a decision or taking an action because it's always like, well, there's something else to know. There's something else to learn. There's
mhm,
something else before I can actually go do the thing.
mhm. Well, and this is super common, like in the personal development world. It's always like, oh, I need this other course, I need this like book, and so there's like everything has its balance. Like, of course, we want to always be like gaining more knowledge and insights into things and deepening our understanding, but most of that comes from experience, and so that is going to be more of the ability to take action on things and figure it out as you go. Like that's going to be the optimal version is like I'm okay making mistakes because that's actually going to deepen my learning more than me just standing on the sidelines reading about it, right? And so
Right.
yeah, overthinking, procrastination, things like that. There is something I'm avoiding within myself, so that there's probably going to be some self-worth there of like, yeah, I don't believe I'm worthy of this, or I may be comparing myself to other people. Maybe I am like focused on somebody that's way further along in their journey. And I'm just like, oh, I need to be that good before I take the steps.
Right.
Um, and a lot of times you get to be that good by taking the steps, right? It's like the cart before the horse thing where it's just like, well, yeah, like ultimately,
Right.
we do just need to take actions there's going to be the fears attached to what if I make a mistake? What if I'm a failure? Like all that stuff. Those are all the things we want to calm down. And so, there's a certain level of listening to that and learning about it. But then there's a certain level of like, okay, well, it's never going to feel perfect. So I do have to take steps. And let's say if something's overwhelming, I encourage people taking small steps, right?
Right.
Something I'm more confident in, I can take bigger steps and I'll be more apt to have that decision making up to speed where it's just like, oh, if something does happen, I know I can adjust faster if I have confidence in something. But so if I'm just starting off in something fresh or new or something that I'm not very good at, we do probably want to build some momentum there. So that is like, I'm not going to, I'm not going to compare myself to the person that's 10 years ahead of me. I'm not going to compare
Sure.
myself to any of these. I'm just going to be like, well, like, yeah, what's the next logical step for me? And that's generally not going to be an overwhelming step. That's going to be like, oh, this is going to stretch me a little bit. Like it might be a little bit uncomfortable, but it makes sense that this would be my logical next step. Right. And so that's
Right.
all we're ever shooting for. And that's a sure sign that we have low self-worth in that specific area is if we're getting way ahead of ourselves. Okay. So if I'm like projecting out, be like, oh, I'm not an expert at this, so I can't even get started. That's generally we're in that place of not feeling very okay. And so that's why we have to understand good things take time. Like everything is a process. It's one foot in front of the other. That's literally all you have to do. Once in a while, you might have to take a pretty decent leap, but most of the time, it is just daily, consistent effort and practice, and that's how we build confidence. It's how we build the ability to move forward with things is we start to gain that momentum. And then we start to see like, oh, like, yeah, I just have to keep following this path.
Right.
The only reason I wouldn't keep following that path is if I have a fear or I have something I'm avoiding that's like standing in the way of me taking the next step. And then that's where I'm going to take steps backwards. Right.
Right.
And so I have to recognize that in myself that, hey, as I take the steps, there's going to be things that are uncomfortable. There's going to be fears that are going to surface. And actually going to be faced with myself. Like I'm going to be faced with what I believe about the situation. And and so I just as those things come up, I want to address them. I want to take a look at them and I want to move through them. And so this is quite literally how I coach is like you can attest to this. Like every week it's just like, oh, what just happened this week? Like
Right.
I don't really care other than like what's happening right now with you because that's representative of the things that you need to overcome to continue your forward movement. Right. So I'm not just like going to dig up the past just to dig it up. It's
Right.
like, well, I went to go take this step and I had all these emotions come up and my thoughts went to this place. And so that activated something from your past. And so that's what we're going to work on. But it's very like in the present, we're heading in this direction and this is where you want to go. And so as the roadblocks surface, like I'm here to help guide you through them so that you don't take 5 steps back. Right.
Right.
So that we can take one step back and look at it and then now we can continue the progress.
Right. So you said something interesting to me around the idea that you could have low self-worth in one area. So I could take that to mean then like I could feel like really good in one specific area of my life. Maybe it's my career, for example, but then feel terrible in terms of self-worth in another. And I think that's interesting because I think most people would attach their self-worth to everything, right? Like it's
Mhm.
a more holistic or like all-encompassing, like if I feel worthy, I'll feel worthy everywhere. Or am I
Mhm.
misinterpreting what you were saying?
No, it's exactly right. So everything is context. So when we talk about these topics, it's there's all the mapping of like, oh, relationship, career, like fitness, whatever. Like
Right.
everybody categorizes things, but and I'm not a big compartmentalization person, but when we're dealing with self worth issues, it's like yeah, like this one belief can be affecting all of them. But it's going to show up more in a dominant area of focus. Okay. So as I'm like going to focus on something and I'm working on it, I'm more apt to find those issues like in the thing that I'm putting a lot of time and energy and effort into. Okay.
Sure.
And so, with your career, like you sorted a lot of those details out. Right. And so,
Right.
you see this commonly, and it's like, yeah, people that are very career driven, like it's like, yeah, like you see them in the business world and it's like, wow. But then like other areas of their life might be disasters. Okay. So it's just like they've been able to overcome it in that area. And everything is developed based on our time, energy, effort that we're putting into it, our focus. Okay. So
Sure.
as I'm focusing on a topic, the self-worth issues are going to get exposed as I'm sorting through that. Okay. They're going to get activated. Okay. And so you see this, like it's, financially, a lot of pain has been around that stuff.
Right.
So generally somebody will have a lot, it'll be obvious if they're struggling in that area and it'll feel like insurmountable and it's like impossible to change. Well, that's just because of all the pain it's anchored in. Okay. Same thing with relationship. If somebody's had heartbreak and they can't seem to figure out dating, there are people or they've been in a relationship and it's been a disaster, right? And they're like, okay, I'm going to shut down that area of my life and I'm just going to avoid it. Okay.
Right.
And so all these things, it's like, well, there's a season for everything, meaning like I may focus more on my career or more on my relationship at different times or whatever it is. But it's like ultimately for a fulfilling life, we probably want to be well rounded. We probably want to address all these things a little bit at a time. And the things are going to develop faster the more focus I put on it. Okay. So, this is like with a like an intensive or something like that. So I might spend like a whole weekend just diving into a relationship and being like, okay, how do I make this better? So it's like you just keep deepening the well, and that's
Right. Right.
get into the little details of like, hey, why isn't this actually working? But if I'm not doing that, I'm staying at the surface level. And so that's where I'm going to be operating from those generalizations. And so I'm going to have all or none thinking. So if I want to improve a relationship, and let's say I've had my heart broken and I have like low value attached to this idea,
Right.
I'm not going to like dive in and try and like fix all that stuff. I'm going to be like, okay, well, I'm going to start to open this back up and I'm going to learn and I'm going to unpack the pain about it. The longer I do that, I'm going to understand, I'm going to make the connection between my actions and how I'm showing up and the feedback I'm getting from the other person. Right. So it's a maturation process, meaning like I'm taking something from this generalized thinking, which is an immature thought process, and then I'm getting more into the details and specifics. And that's how I level up is I have to refine all these little details in order to operate in a clean way in relationship to that category.
Right.
So yeah, everything's context based. Everything's like, well, how much pain have you experienced in that area of your life? If you've experienced a lot of pain and you've avoided it, okay, well, you left it in that heavy place. So you're going to want to continue to avoid it. It's going to be very uncomfortable for you, but it's also going to be your biggest source of growth, right? So that pain, if I can unpack that and work through that, that can level me up in a lot of different ways. So it's always the things I fear. It's always the pain that's going to give me the biggest bang for my buck in terms of growth and development. And so that's just where I have extremely low self-worth.
Right. Right.
And so the mind's just linking to your experiences to the category of like, okay, if I've sorted it out in business, it's like, yeah, I'm not questioning myself. I'm not doubting myself. I have so many reps that it's just like automatic. But, maybe when I go to do this, I'm in extreme self-doubt. I'm paralyzed. I can't move forward.
Sure. Right.
That's going to be, I have a lot of fears. I have a lot of blanket generalizations about that topic that probably don't make any sense. Okay. And you'll hear
Right.
this like, all men suck or all women or, blah,
Sure.
blah, blah. It's the all stuff. Like that's a sure sign that, your thinking around that topic is probably immature, that you need to develop in that area and that you need to unpack some pain around it so you can get more specific in the details and really understand it better.
Right. Right.
The bottom line is, self-worth. It's something we can shape. You may start somewhere, but we can always work on these things and develop them. And so part of that is really getting to understand yourself at a deeper level. So, you came from somewhere, things have happened to you. And if we've left it mentally, emotionally in those places, it doesn't really change until we address it. So that's kind of the moral of this is we want to, if we're having challenges in a certain area, if we want to improve on it, if we have deep desires around getting further in that area, we're probably going to need to look at the past. So we're going to build self-worth by simply taking a look at your beliefs around that subject and really unpacking the heavy emotions and starting to reframe them in a way that feels cleaner and allows us to not function from that place of safety and protection. So that's the name of the game is we have to feel safe to move forward. So anytime you can take a deeper look and reassess, being like, hey, is this actually still a threat to me? Or was this just something from my past? That's an opportunity for growth and some clarifying moments so we can move forward in a new way. So thank you for joining us today. And we look forward to next time.
Yeah. Talk to you later.
All right. Bye, Holly.